Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Malevo Sipodi. I'm a South African joining you from Lower Saxony in Oldenburg in Germany, and I am the moderator for today's digital dialogue. For the benefit of participants who are blind or have visual impairment, all speakers will begin with a short self-description. I'll start. I am a Black woman wearing a purple lipstick. I'm wearing red-framed reading glasses and I have my hair up in brown locks. Now let's get into it, shall we? Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions exploring civil society perspectives on the emerging digital world. Today, we discuss dual use of digital technologies. Our concept note for today asks, how should civil society today navigate the complex challenges of dual use technologies? Our world is grappling with pressing ethical, security, and governance questions from drones and software to business models and technology firms. Each innovation holds immense potential for peace and progress, yet can equally serve as tools for conflict and control. Though dual use dilemmas have existed for centuries, they became more defined in the 20th century. Now, in the 21st century, digital technologies bring unique challenges and reshape this old age dilemma. Artificial intelligence, drones, cybersecurity, and bioengineering each raise profound questions. How do we balance innovation with ethical responsibility? What safeguards should be in place to prevent misuse? And who ultimately bears responsibility for these dual purpose advancements? This dialogue invites us to explore these pressing issues and examine the critical role of civil society organizations in advocating for responsible technology use, fostering cooperation, and making informed choices as technology users. Today, we consider how civil society organizations can work to ensure that these technologies serve the public good rather than become instruments of harm. We have a terrific panel joining us today to help us discuss these issues and more. Today, we're joined by Chantal Joris, who is a senior legal officer at Article 19. We have Giulio Coppi, who is a senior humanitarian officer from Access Now. And we have Victoria Ibezim Ohaeri, who is the executive director from Spaces for Change. Welcome, colleagues. Each panelist will introduce themselves and share their key points for around 5 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion and questions. We also invite you to help shape the conversation by adding your questions and reflections in the chat box. So anytime when the panelist is speaking, if you have a reflection, you have a question, please do put it in the chat box. Because of time, we'll try to get to all the questions, but hopefully we will get to all of them. But we'll certainly try if we'll try and just like get to as many questions as possible. Chantal, would you please turn on your camera and join me here? And please introduce yourself. Also tell us where you're joining from and share your key points. But importantly, don't forget to start with a brief self-description. Welcome, Chantal.
Of course. Hey, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Chantal Joris. I'm with Freedom of Expression organization Article 19. I'm a white woman with brown hair, and I'm wearing a pair of glasses and a black shirt and black blazer today. I was thinking in preparation of this seminar. I mean, it really involves a lot of complex and very timely questions, and it's hard to give sort of general recommendations as to how these issues should be approached, given that we have so many different technology and uses in play. I would try to make a couple of general points. At Article 19, we frequently look at this from two angles. On the one hand, we address questions about how technology and communication infrastructure can be used by different actors and for various purposes. And depending on the use cases, the context they're used in, and by whom they are used, the human rights concerns can vary quite significantly. So we might advocate on two fronts. Sometimes it's quite focused on preventing certain uses of technologies that can be particularly harmful for human rights, and which might include problematic actors or contexts. But sometimes our advocacy has also focused on responding to state measures or regulation that, for example, focus on countering the use of technologies by malicious actors, for example, terrorists, but that do so in a manner that is overly restrictive and not in compliance with freedom of expression standards. And let me be a bit more concrete to turn to these respective scenarios with examples. In the first aspect, we often warn against this so-called function or mission creep, meaning the repurposing of technologies initially used into another application that can be much more harmful for human rights. And in this context, I have to emphasize that often there is a human rights issue with the technology itself, thinking, for example, of emotion recognition, biometric technologies. Those have harmful implications for human rights, almost irrespective in what context they are used. But I still want to give you an example of a report that we've issued a couple of years ago that worked on smart cities in Myanmar to exemplify what I mean by mission creep. Smart cities have often been viewed as an enabler of like innovation, benefiting individuals to be able to access health services, for example, and other services. And this assumption that greater data collection can facilitate the provision of certain government services. And we have repeatedly challenged this notion and emphasized the potential implications for freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly, as well as the right to privacy, of course. In this report, we specifically investigated questions around the procurement in Myanmar of CCTV infrastructure. And we highlighted two things that I think are interesting for the purposes of today's discussion. One, we explained in the report how CCTV cameras can form the infrastructural backbone of a host of emerging technologies. So that can include AI application like facial or emotion recognition. And here we have the first part of this mission creep, where CCTVs simply being installed cameras for safety can then be repurposed to carry out remote biometric identification, which is even more problematic from a human rights perspective. But second, also the report was published shortly after the coup, and we have seen after the coup that the military started authoring new legislation and taking control of this infrastructure and these technologies. And there were increased indications that they were using this smart cities infrastructure to monitor people who were protesting and who were expressing themselves, and thus weaponizing these same technologies, which were initially wise concerning, but sort of deployed on a seemingly positive basis that was supposed to serve the individual. So, and our responses had to go, I mean, it involves many complex issues. And so our responses and recommendations ranged from calling for outright bans, like banning mass surveillance in public and banning the design, development, and use of emotion recognition technology, but also subjecting any sort of implementation of technologies to the human rights test of legality, legitimacy, proportionality, necessity, and proportionality. So here as well, different responses needed for different actors, for Myanmar itself, for the military junta, for third states, as well as companies developing these technologies. And of course, we have also seen this repurposing in other armed conflicts, where surveillance technologies or artificial intelligence has been used increasingly to target civilians. Communication technologies have been weaponized. And so this raises very problematic questions about compliance with international law at the intersection of human rights and humanitarian law. And a second issue I want to touch upon briefly is also the problematic human rights issues that arise in the in the context of the counter response to potential nefarious uses of technologies. Counterterrorism actions being one example. States often highlight the use of advanced technology or social media tools by terrorist groups in, for example, recruitment, fundraising, or even execution of terrorist acts. And the consensus on the need to tackle this nefarious use of technologies has been very loud. The preparedness to adopt quite wide-ranging measures has been such that the human rights implications have been often overlooked. So in the counterterrorism sphere, we have seen many measures that have not been in line with the principles, again, of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality. Another example would be, for example, encryption technology, where it has been mentioned, including in armed conflicts or for preparation of terrorist attacks, for example, how this has been used by the malicious actors. But at the same time, it's used by those human rights defenders, journalists, or even the public at large that needs to protect themselves from those same actors. So these discussions about the good or negative use of these same technologies, they are really, we see them everywhere. And there is, again, there's not an easy, straightforward, specific recommendation or a specific set of safeguards that apply to all these different uses and technologies. From a freedom of expression perspective, we always try to ground our recommendations in human rights and the different responsibilities and layer of responsibilities, whether it's from the state deploying these technologies, from the companies developing them and selling them, or from the states hosting those companies that might export certain technologies. So I would stop there, but I would open with these remarks, trying to look at it from different angles.
Thank you so much, Chantal. That's a really great start. We do have a question from Farai that I would like to pose. And as Giulio comes in, maybe then Giulio can touch, just before getting into their input, you can touch a little bit on this question. It says, it's from Farai Guelo. Thank you for this important seminar. I just didn't get the definition of dual-use technologies, and I got lost right at the beginning and just the framing of today's discussion. We apologize for that, Farai. It is important for us to always remain accessible. Giulio, would you be able to just start us off with what is dual-use technology, and then get into your input? Welcome, Giulio.
Thank you, and absolutely. First of all, I'm an Italian white man with a little uncapped beard and slightly receding hairline, black hair, wearing a half-zip sweater and round glasses. And I'm working from my home office close to Paris in France. And I thank you, everyone, for the invite, and especially, Malebo for the introduction, and Chantal for opening up with such a actually interesting and instructive first contribution. The dual use of technology and the definition of dual use is something that I was going to tackle anyway, because I come from it as a humanitarian person. I work with Access Now that works on protecting and expanding digital rights worldwide, but I cover a niche part of the digital rights. I cover digital rights as they intersect the situations of conflict and violence. And as a humanitarian, I'm used to a different concept of dual use. To make a long story short, dual use for the humanitarian sector is basically everything. And it's usually very often a fig leaf for the parties that are involved either in the conflict or in the political discussion around the conflict to limit certain goods or tools or items that can be digital, non-digital, technological or non-technological from accessing a war zone. One of my first experiences as a humanitarian was as a detention person. I was visiting prisons. And one thing that was very instructive to me was to have to deal with the access condition to a detention center, where basically you cannot bring anything inside because everything will be considered, or almost everything will be considered as dual use, including a pencil that could be used to harm someone or to open a lock, or a spoon that were not given in the kitchen in some parts, in some prisons, because of the risk that could be transformed into a knife or in a weapon, something that then later was brought to the airport screening process. Anyway, this is the kind of pipeline, and this is something I wanted to address in my introduction. This is the pipeline of, I would call it, unfortunately, a natural pipeline from normal technology to dual use label that a lot of technology and a lot of items go through. And this is something that at the same time we need to be wary of. We need to be aware and wary of. So dual use technology is any kind of technology or artifacts that can be used for both a good purpose or a bad purpose, adopting a moral lens, an ethical lens. In the specific of a conflict, for example, dual use technology can be, we can summarize it, for example, as a drone. A drone is an example of a dual use technology that can be used to observe a displacement movement or the condition of displaced people, or maybe a landslide and the impact on the community. But it can also be used to spy on the same people. It can be used to drop weapons on them or explosive devices. That is a typical example of dual use. Another dual use is fuel. Fuel can be considered as a dual use because it can be used, for example, to power a communication tower for allowing humanitarian coordination. It can also be used to produce weapons or explosive devices. So to respond to Fry, dual use, it really is about intent. It's not about the object itself, in my opinion and in my experience. Where it intersects the legal framework is where it comes to special types of technology. Special types of technology that do have special characteristics that improve or expand their potential impact for good or for bad reasons. One example can be, for example, the example of non-conventional weapons. The example of non-conventional weapons is a typical one because there is a treaty that adds some restriction on uses and development of some non-conventional weapons, and actually it forbids some specific types of non-conventional weapons. And this is the reason I'm raising this is because it clearly shows that there is a capacity from the international community to have a rational approach, distinguishing between something that has high power and high impact on a certain situation and something that is not that necessary in terms of screening, in terms of filtering. And unfortunately, the dual use label very often is used to stop humanitarian assistance to community. This is very often used as a gatekeeping exercise, for example, to stop mobile phones or repairing materials. It can be used to block water filters. And this is a form of manipulation of the intent behind the idea of dual use restrictions or dual use controls to punish the population. It's a weaponization of this instrument that unfairly targets population. So this is, I'm mentioning this to complement a little bit what has been mentioned by Chantal, that was rightly framing it in a human rights perspective, where positive or neutral technologies can then be used for nefarious purposes. And this is the other side of the spectrum. So in situations of conflict where this kind of empty shell of the dual use definition is then filled with evil intent by punishing whole swath of the population, by stopping them from accessing goods or services, or by, for example, impeding connectivity to be restored because there is no fuel for running the towers, or because there are no repairing equipments, or because the technicians are not allowed to come in, or these kind of things. This is all to say that technology is an artifact. Technology is a human artifact. It is done by humans. It is used by humans. It is deployed by humans, until we get to general AI, which is a whole different discussion, and we're definitely not there. And as any kind of technology responds to a purpose and to a use by humans and by the people that are deploying it. In the case, for example, of humanitarian response, there is an assumption that humanitarians will use that for good purposes, will use that technology for good. But there is also a good, solid experience of humanitarian technology being deployed with corporate actors and then being sold in markets to law enforcement agencies, to migration control agencies, to intelligence groups or military groups. There's a lot of discussion about, for example, drones and the potential of drones in certain areas and the possibility to have autonomous drones. That, if you look at the schematics of humanitarian drones and military drones, the command and control system is the same. It's exactly the same. It's the same principle, the same mechanisms, the same schematics, possibly the same corporate tech providers. So this is something that we need to be aware of, is that we need to simplify the concept, because there is a lot of talk about what dual use might be, the AI, the complexity. Complexity is the enemy. Complexity is a smokescreen that is used to hide very simple concepts. And the fact is that technology responds to a purpose and to an intent. All technology can be used for nefarious purposes, and we need guarantees and guardrails. That is why having conventions and treaties that regulate certain uses that are known to be nefarious, that are known to be evil, that are known to have a negative impact on society, such as, for example, most forms of spyware. Most of these tools and most of these systems need to be restricted, need to be regulated, need to be monitored. And we need to also to be wary of the fact that a lot of this complexity is used then to stop some other tools and systems and technologies that are, on the other hand, useful for the communities, that are useful for the population, and to stop these communities from accessing those technologies under the pretext that they might be misused, they might be used for other purposes. So the reason I'm saying this is because as a community, when we come and discuss, for example, lethal autonomous weapon system, we are at a watershed moment where we have an objective by 2026 now to hopefully get to a binding instrument that might regulate and restrict some uses of these lethal autonomous weapon systems. And now we see a lot of states backtracking from that kind of initial engagement, a lot of people pushing back and saying that potentially, that might not happen. And this is the problem, because this opens the way to those dual use technologies to be tested in war and then imported back home and used in everyday life. So yeah, this is to wrap up my conclusion, and I give it back to you, Malebo.
Thank you so much, Julia. You may switch your camera off for now. If you've just joined us, my name is Malebo Sepodi, and I'm facilitating this discussion. We are discussing dual use of digital technologies, and we are joined by a brilliant panel. Victoria, may you please switch on your camera, unmute yourself, and don't forget to start with a self-description. Welcome, Victoria. I look forward to hearing your inputs. And to all the audience out here, please drop your reflections and your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them in a minute. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Malebo. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Ibezim Oheri. I'm the director at Spaces for Change, and I'm joining in from Lagos. I am a Black woman wearing dark frames and also wearing a purple lipstick like Malebo, and I'm dark in complexion. I will be talking about dual-use technologies, especially those with surveillance capabilities, and it will draw extensively from the findings of our latest report titled The Proliferation of Dual-Use Surveillance Technologies in Nigeria, Deployment, Risk, and Accountability. That report is a follow-up report to a previous report called The Security Playbook of Digital Authoritarianism in Nigeria. That previous report, what it did was to map the supply chains for surveillance technologies coming into Nigeria, understand the motivations or the objectives for their importation, how they are being used, and who the importers and supply companies were, and some of the specific effects those technologies were having on human rights and civic space. This follow-up report now built on the finding of that previous report, which now the focus of this one is now on the accountability pathways. Having found that there were numerous gaps, there was a lot of the proposing happening and a diversion of technologies brought in, especially for countering insecurity and terrorism. So where does accountability lie? And one of the major findings from that report was that the dual use nature of most surveillance technologies is a driver of unbridled proliferation that we're seeing in the country. And that the proliferation has really persisted because of not just the dual use nature, but their corresponding capacity to be used for both military and civilian uses. So to build on the definition that was previously shared, the dual use in the Nigerian context is rooted in the distinction between civil and military uses. And therefore, dual use technologies with surveillance capabilities refers to those items that are designed to enable the covert surveillance of natural persons by monitoring them or extracting their data or collecting, analyzing their data from either information or telecommunication systems. And technology-dependent countries like Nigeria, they look to other countries to supply them with technological equipment and other infrastructure that can enhance its intelligence gathering and service delivery, so to speak. So what we now did is to reveal how these dual-use technologies used for civilian and military purposes, how they're imported into the country, the nature of safeguards that exist in the country, and also the implications, of course, again, on civic space and human rights. And having understood what the gaps were, we now went further to look to the countries exporting these technologies to Nigeria and other developing countries to find out to what extent can they also be held accountable. Because beyond holding the importers accountable, we argued that exporters also bear a corresponding obligation to export technologies that will be used ethically and responsibly. Some of our major findings was that first of all, that a lot of countries, including Nigeria, they're following America's footsteps. And just the way America's securitized their response to 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, it created the foundation for massive expansion of anti-terrorism frameworks, including surveillance initiatives. And that would a similar incident in Nigeria would be the bombing of the UN headquarters in Abuja, and the country followed, mimicked that America's securitization approach to develop sophisticated surveillance initiatives that can preemptively detect and eliminate threats and combat terrorism or contain whatever external aggressors there may be. We found that the surveillance is already enabled by a lot of drivers, especially numerous statutes, national statutes emboldening law enforcement agencies, a vast array of law enforcement agencies to conduct surveillance and also permit the derogation of certain human rights, especially the right to privacy under certain circumstances. And also, we found that, yes, under the law, Nigerian law, we have legal safeguards for privacy rights, but despite those privacy rights, the security considerations trump the safeguards for privacy rights, which means that law enforcement can still intercept data and intrude, undertake privacy intrusions under certain circumstances. And the open language and the lack of definitions in the numerous legislations that confer surveillance powers upon state authorities it easily allows for subjective interpretation in ways that rationalizes the suppression of dissent or empowers law enforcement to bring different kinds of demands under the allowed exceptions. And another important thing to know is that a lot of dual-use technologies that have been brought into the country provided evidence of how they have been misused. And the highest incidence we have is repurposing for spying on political opposition, especially during election seasons. That was the highest evidence. And the other has to do with the proposing for tracking, monitoring activists, and sometimes censoring online content. And a lot of these technologies, we listed some of the popular ones that are in the country, like the Hacking Team and Fisher, the remote control systems, the WISE intelligence technology, and numerous biometric data collection initiatives. And one thing to note is that countries like Israel, China, and the United States are the top suppliers of the dual-use surveillance technologies are imported in Nigeria that also have been arbitrarily used or proposed in Nigeria. And we listed some of the technologies from these countries that have been used for purposes different from what was originally declared to be the reason for importing them. And beyond state actors, non-state actors also involved in spyware abuse. And that is worrying because Nigeria has certain parts of the country are ravaged by conflict and terrorism. And some of these dual-use technologies are getting into the hands of these people. For instance, we found some of the terrorist groups are beginning to use drones for surveillance. And the authorities are fearing that it can rapidly progress to weaponized platforms. And not just the drones, also for unmanned aerial vehicles, becoming a more attractive to terrorist group as a delivery method for their terrorist attacks. So we also looked at the importation controls within the country and also looked at the controls from the exporting countries. We did a comparison between the import controls we have and the export control regimes that are applicable out there. And we saw some significant gaps within the internal controls. And despite some of those gaps, we found out that some agencies are using their own administrative discretion to close some of those gaps. But looking at those export controls, as rigorous and strong as they may seem, we found out that there are certain factors that are limiting their effectiveness. And one of the such limitations is human rights considerations, which a lot of countries include as part of the safeguard measures for preventing proliferation of dual-use technologies. Their human rights considerations lack clarity and consistency. There's a lot of differential in the way they're applying for countries, especially countries between the global north and the global south. I'll provide an example. When Nigeria wanted to buy weapons from the United States, and the United States blocked that procurement on human rights consideration. And because accusing some military people for using some previous weapons technology supplied to them to commit human rights abuses. But we compared that to the supply of weapons to other countries like Israel that also alleged to commit serious human rights violation. And we could see some differential in the application of these human rights considerations across countries. We also looked at a lot of countries who put their national security considerations first, their economic interests first, their own diplomatic influence first, ahead that of the importer. So that means that importing countries still have a responsibility to strengthen their safeguards, their import controls. And we also looked at the effect of the technological dependency between the North and the South, and the amount of money African states that are spending on digital surveillance technologies and not trying to use even a fraction of that to increase their own technological capabilities. And we found that there's also something to look in, some concern there. And also how some of these contracts for acquisition of surveillance technologies, we looked into the framing of those contracts and how they are always shrouded in secrecy, and lack of transparency opens the doors for corruption. And
thank you.
Yeah, so I will stop there, and I'll be happy to answer other questions, but I have shared the report with Ryan, and we'll be happy anybody that has any further questions can send us an email, and we'll be happy to answer their questions.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I'm sorry to cut you off there. I mean, we could have a whole discussion with each panelist on their own, and because of time, we have to cut it short because we want to get in the question from the audience. The audience, please don't forget to put in your questions in the chat box, and also identify, just say who the question is, you asking the question to. So at this point, thank you again, Victoria, for your inputs, and thank you to all the panelists. Those were thought-provoking inputs, and I'm glad that we have different perspectives, especially from different landscapes and, looking at different countries. And I'm looking forward, what I'm really looking forward to is, first, before we get into the question, the three panelists, can you all turn your cameras on, please? What I'm curious or want to hear from you is, do you have any reflections or questions first, seeing, teasing out the intersections and the connections between each other's inputs, or any question that you want to pose to a fellow panelist? As I said, I'm interested in how we actually bring the conversation together and see where we agree, where we disagree, and where the intersections lie. Who wants to start? If you have any questions or reflection based on what your fellow panelist has said before we get into the question. Okay, Giulio. Okay, we'll do Giulio and then we get to Chantal and then Victoria.
First, so
okay, Chantal, go ahead.
No, I was looking for
much,
the hand up sign and I didn't find it, so I gave up and just used my voice. Perhaps I think I found the reflections from Giulio also super interesting, because often when we think about dual use, we think about sort of the negative uses, the bad uses for nefarious purposes, for military purposes, and how you emphasized really also how this can be used almost as an excuse to also hinder access of civilian populations and communities to positive uses of these technologies. Perhaps I would be interested, given that these principles of proportionality, humanity, military necessity, they're really the key principles of humanitarian laws, seem to be right at the core of this discussion as to, can we attack a TV tower, or can we use drones, or will we also too much, can we focus more on the military use of these technologies, and hence they are fair game to be attacked and eliminated or banned, or do we have to focus more on the civilian dependence on these same technologies, and also how you see this to be able to be combined with human rights considerations and human rights considerations of proportionality, which also continue to apply in these contexts.
Thank you, Chantal. And it's a tough one. To keep it simple, I think, and this is just my reflection, I don't think there is agreement in the sector. I don't think there is a clear, a definitive answer to this. But what I believe is that we need to be protective in the way, progressive and protective at the same time, the way we interpret the term dual use. There was a little bit the underlying message in my opening. We should always approach it in the most protective way for the communities. So, and that might require a radical shift in the way we look at the application of that term. So, for example, when it comes to applying surveillance technology in civilian spaces in peacetime, that might require removing cameras. While in some areas in conflict, that might require allowing humanitarians to run cameras or to run GIS imagery or satellite imagery on conflict zones to allow better determination and targeting of humanitarian assistance. So despite the fact that armed actors might claim that that imagery is a dual use and that satellites are dual use, for example. And I think, as I mentioned, it's intent that we should be looking at, in my opinion. And there's sometimes something that get lost in what some people confusingly call the fog of war. There's no fog of war. It's like humanitarian uses and humanitarian technology should be exempted from sanctions and restrictions. And we all know that international law says that. But still, the dual use label is slammed on a lot of things in a totally gratuitous way very often. And at the same time, there is no, there is not like the same kind of scrutiny on the way that technologies that are being clearly deployed and tested in conflict is then brought back to the civilian space. Why is not that like dual use by design. Like the same scrutiny is not applied to the same technologies when they come back home. And this is something that annoys me to no end. It clearly shows a disregard for the privacy and the protection of the people, and just a kind of utilitarian perspective. And that, bridges quite well with a question that I see in the chat for you, Chantal, about the application of those technologies in non-military conflicts. So I'll let you, go on that one.
Thank you so much. Okay, go ahead, Chantal.
No, just I think it also ties with the question. Someone asked about the use of these technologies in non-conflict situation, and also the steps Article 19 is taken to shift the focus towards human rights considerations. I mean, to the extent that we can rely on the human rights framework, and again, as a freedom of expression organization, that is the main human right we invoke. We always try to emphasize that one of the bases to restrict freedom of expression, one of the legitimate aims is, for example, national security, or it is the rights and reputations of others. So these considerations, be it in the discussions around counterterrorism, national security, or thinking about, or other public emergencies, hurricanes, pandemics, whatever, these considerations can fit in the human rights framework, and they should be not viewed as it is one over the other. Is it safety against human rights, or it's security against human rights? But it's all in the end to ensure the protection of human rights. And I think one of the complications, specifically in this national security space, is that there is quite little transparency, both on the domestic level. There is little transparency around the, for example, procurement of technologies to the extent that they are used for national security, what sort of technologies are used, because it's often used by law enforcement, intelligence agency, etc., which are not prone to being open to scrutiny and transparency. And the same, in a sense, works as well on the UN level. Again, talking about these counterterrorism efforts, they start to really provide, talking about mission creep, that also applies to counterterrorism aspects that start to pervade all areas that the United Nations is working in. And it's very difficult to navigate this system and to understand where these discussions even take place, and to bring this human rights perspective. So yeah, I would highlight this as the key pitch that we always try to make, but also the challenge is to find a seat even at the table of these discussions, both domestic and more international context.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Victoria, you have your hand up. Are you adding to the conversation or asking a different question?
Yes, I just want to add to that conversation about whether it is safety for human rights or is it national security against human rights. I think one of the major questions cross-cutting in most contexts is the term national security is nebulous. It is largely undefined. It is really what the executive regards as being a national security issue. So that list is endless. That list is just like a big hole that anything can be thrown in there. And as long as there are no limits, no defined limit to what constitutes a threat to national security, then these conversations will continue for a very long time. Then the second part, why national security is still another clog in the wheel of progress, is we have to match that with trends in the technologically advanced countries. We're seeing a conscious drive towards growing their national dual-use technology capabilities, and ultimately for military purposes in the long term. So from a military strategic standpoint, we find that dual-use technologies, it requires a short lead time to be converted into military technologies. So even the ones for civilian use have done military security or security hardware or software. So that is a trend that hasn't really, been taken into account, making it easy for proliferation to persist in many parts of the world. Then another one is a lot of initiatives, a number of best practice initiatives, or what has been regarded as best practice initiatives around the world. Some companies are subscribing to them, but the voluntary nature of these initiatives is another concern. when something is voluntary and sometimes is interpreted to meet permissive, and states and companies need to, or government or whoever that is developing the standards, we need to move away from voluntary initiatives to initiatives or provisions or legal frameworks that can be translated into legally enforceable guarantees. The absence of those legally enforceable guarantees has made it very easy for countries and companies around the world to continue to churn out these dual-use technologies, and also proliferation has persisted, and there is not much happening to ensure that these technologies get into the wrong, ensure that they don't get to the wrong hands. So I think these are three main issues, and the issue about transparency, I think someone talked about it, is also very, very important, to ensure that both regulators, both corporations implement transparency requirements. There's still a lot of opacity in the industry, still a source of concern, and it has to be made easy to access information about the licensing for the spyware, how they are produced, what human rights considerations or assessment go into their production, and how they can, ethical use can be enforced across jurisdictions.
Thank you so much. Because of time, I'm going to go into the questions. There's many questions that are coming in for our panelists from our audience. Thank you so much for engaging. It's really important to shape this conversation. Julia, you've got a question here saying, given current resistance, what concrete or realistic steps do you believe are achievable to regulate and potentially ban lethal autonomous weapon systems?
Thank you. I think we have two campaigns right now that are interesting that will be starting soon. One is for removing the label of dual use from connectivity, anything related to connectivity. This is an example. We are going to lead that struggle and try to remove that kind of definition from anything related to community connectivity and internet access. And the other one is supporting existing efforts by many across the humanitarian and development and human rights field to try and push for this treaty. I do believe it is feasible. I do believe it is realistic, but it will require a lot of clear eye and cynical discussions in terms of what are these tools good for. Because to be honest, lethal autonomous weapon systems are hardly a good sell for a lot of armies and a lot of groups. Think about small armies and small groups. They do not probably have the technology and the access to the manufacturing needed to deploy, design, build, deploy, maintain, and run and oversee this kind of technologies. They will depend on external actors. They will create dependencies on small armies and small states. Small states have no interest in this kind of weapons, to be completely honest. That will increase their level of strategic dependency. And big armies, especially the generals and the people in charge, they are likely to be very skeptical about giving up that much control in what is substantially their job. Is their job to develop the strategy? Is their job to call the shots in the fighting? Is their job to train the people to be able to do the targeting and to take responsibility and ownership for their behavior in the battlefield? In a way, I think we can leverage also on the other side of the fence good arguments to say, we don't need this. Like, why will you need more capacity for destruction, more unsupervised potential for mass killing? Like, why? Who is this good for? So this is the kind of argument that we hope might potentially convince more people, at least to have them not to veto this proposal, not to go against it.
Thank you. So Victoria, there's a question. It says, hi, Victoria and everyone. And I think the question is for any of the panelists, from Maha Babeka and Barbara. It's Maha Babeka, who's a program manager at the Barbara Schiller Commemorative Clinic in Toronto. Maybe Victoria, you can take this question. It says, what policy or regulatory approaches can civil society promote to address the risks of dual-use technologies, and how can these approaches avoid stifling innovation? I mean, I guess that's the question for everyone asking in terms of how do we say they're harmful and hold them accountable, but then how do we not make sure that it doesn't stifle innovation? Yeah.
Yeah, so in our context, civic actors have responded to arbitrary surveillance and initiatives in many ways, especially through research inquiries like we have just done, and also halting legislations that enable surveillance, especially over surveillance or unlawful surveillance. Civil society organizations are also challenging secrecy or increasing transparency of this contract, surveillance contract, demanding increased accountability and transparency in the procurement of surveillance technologies. They are also spearheading accountability campaigns. These are some of the ways that civil society groups. There is also a lot of what we're trying to do through research is to look at other countries with stronger safeguards to see what they are doing and to see how we can inspire authorities to borrow some of the best practices. For instance, we found from Israel, like Israel is the home of the NSO group, despite being the home of the NSO group, we found out that some of the export requirements include end user and end use verifications. They have post shipment verifications, they have periodic reporting, they have inspection requirement, they have compliance audits and record keeping. And the same thing applies to China. They also have end user and end use verifications, and they have embargo on exports on dry use technologies. They also have penalties and inspections audits. So we are also trying to spearhead advocacy for countries without this sort of safeguards to integrate them into their national import control regimes.
Thank you. Just looking at the time, Chantal, I see your hand. While you give us your input, I would like you to think about the question that's asked in terms of, I wonder, it's from Hector Dominique, who says, I wonder about your opinion on tech governance, oversight, and effective accountability. Is there such a thing as human rights audits, and who needs to pay for all that? Even the European model allows exceptions connected with national security. Oh, I see that Julio has already said something there, but you can just add, just so that we keep the time. And yeah, Chantal.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to also make a point around the question of innovation. I mean, very often when also I work a lot on regulatory frameworks in the European Union. They say often, there is no such regulation maybe in the US, so it would stifle innovation. Some companies have even threatened to leave the EU market if certain regulations are passed. Generally speaking, we think that these fears over competitiveness and threats to innovation are overstated and a bit of a cheap excuse to oppose key protections against AI's human rights harms, for example. And some compliance costs might be there, but in the end, that will also make the systems more reliable. It will make the systems more accountable, and increase trust in those products, which we ultimately think will help foster innovation. So we're never particularly convinced by this argument of stifling innovation through limiting human rights impacts, negative human rights impacts.
Thank you. And I guess maybe on a closing note, we could all close with this question. We can go around the panelists and just think about this question and then include your closing remarks. The question is from Shrita Harish from Oxfam International. I apologize if I did not pronounce your name correctly, who is based in India. And the question is, can the panelists comment on whether the current world order and the checks and balances that are present have been either effective or are ready in terms of thinking 5 to 10 years from now to intervene, to check the use of technology? We can start with you, Julio.
That's hard to wrap up in a few words.
Let's just try our best. I'm asking the audience just to give us a few more minutes as we wrap up. Because
this will take a whole new hour. Okay. No easy balls here. No easy ones here. Okay. I don't think we ever put any checks on the use of technologies. Historically, that has never been a thing. Checks are on checks have come with broader human rights based normative actions. I wouldn't say it's very hard. Let me frame it in this way. This is also linked to the question was done before about innovation. I think we need to stay clear of this discussion that one is against the other, or that law and human rights are against the use of technology or against the use of innovative tools. This is not a thing. We need to stop thinking about that, because I think otherwise we get into a clash. Human rights are protected regardless of the way. Like, privacy is not just about technology. Data protection is not just about technology. Data protection is about paper and pencil, about everything. It's about the management of information. So we have to stop thinking about check the use of technology. There are some technologies that are purposely done to do harm, and those need to be checked and potentially removed from society. And then there are some human rights considerations that limit certain behaviors. Those behaviors can happen through a people or can happen through a camera. And it is the same, but the principle is the same. And I would say that we have been very good lately of building solid human rights instruments. The point is that tech-driven, hyper-tech people try to dismantle that under the pretext that this is stopping them from creating cool gadgets. No, I disagree with that. I think human rights have been very cool in providing us, and not everyone, but an increasing amount of people out of poverty, an increasing amount of people in good health conditions, and providing everyone with good technology. And we need to protect the good technology. We need to fight back against bad uses of technology and protect the human rights framework.
Thank you, Chantal. And it'd also be great to go into like the ethics of considering that. And I know that I'm just putting a lot on you as you close.
So I will try to group these questions going. I think overall, I think the overarching issue is there a political will, yes or no? And then that goes into so many different considerations. One of the questions that I didn't respond to earlier was about, national security exemption. So you have like a regulation of AI, but then when you come to the potentially most problematic uses, we exempt it from the regulation. So it's like, okay, we would have expected more. Sometimes measures are also of a rather protectionist nature, also under the guise of, we need to have safe technologies, but really what we want is also to limit the possibility of other countries to export into our markets. So it can also be a protectionist measure when it comes to regulation. We also have a huge issue around market power that also shows when it comes to AI companies, both on like infrastructure level and also application and use. So long story short, I think in the end, it will be a political will that determines many of these international regulatory frameworks and some of the domestic regulatory frameworks that will follow, really. We will continue always to push for human rights-based approaches. We can be happy when we get incremental wins. But honestly speaking, I think it's often more about damage limitation than the human rights community being able to properly set the tone and the framing and the approach taken to these technologies.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Yes, I think there is really no shortage of recommendations that have been provided by experts, by institutes, by groups around the world about the application of human rights in technologies. But I think personally, this is my view, that technology can still fall into the wrong hands in spite of all due diligence and precautions, especially in developing countries that are mere consumers and importers of technology. So there is a limitation on the extent to which they can control proliferation in their jurisdictions. So that is why what we find most appealing is the advocacy around human rights by design, which has been proposed as a key tool for the protection of human rights in the age of technology. What that principle is simply talking about is that you can rein in the human rights abuses at the point of production, that producers should commit to designing technologies that respect human rights by default, instead of enabling features that can give right to human rights abuses. So for dual-use technologies such as surveillance technologies, the designers of the tools what they can do is to preempt the human rights impact of the tool they're producing and incorporate safeguards at the design stage. And some people are asking, why create them in the first place if you know that there are possibility that they can be used for negative purposes? So at the corporate level, I think big organizations like Google are taking steps to incorporate this philosophy in the development of their products. We found an example where Google engaged experts to conduct a human rights assessment at the development stage of one of their recognition application program interfaces for use in the, I think, entertainment industry. So corporates can also introduce features that restrict some functionalities of technologies which may be abused. And this is just an example, one of the numerous ways that you can incorporate human rights by design at the production stage, rather than just waiting at the injury stage, where a lot of things lives have been lost and they cannot be recovered. And there are too many losses that are irrecoverable. So that would be my way of closing this conversation.
Thank you so much, Victoria. To all the panelists, thank you for joining us, Chantal, Julio, and Victoria. Thank you for providing those thought-provoking discussion points, and it gives us a lot to think about. And I'm sure you have been seeing how the audience have been interacting with your points and with your, with what you've come to discuss today. And thank you to our audience for your involvement. We apologize again for going over the time, but as we say that these discussions, we normally need a lot of time for it, and I'm so grateful that we are able to, get in what we can. And I'm sure everything that the links that have been shared will be shared with you in the coming days. And thank you to the organizers for today's discussion, for the topic, and actually always facilitating these discussions. They are quite important, and as we say, we can talk, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to hold certain institutions to account and hold ourselves to account as well. And the link will be shared with you in the next coming days, and further resources from our panelists organization will be sent to all participants who attended today's session. And if you would like to get in touch with our contributors, you can do this via the team here at the center, and you can send an email to Ryan. My name is Malebo Sipodi. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the audience. Continue having a great morning, afternoon, and evening till we meet again or see each other again. Bye-bye.